The flag went up an hour before dawn. Not the flag you're imagining, not the skull and crossbones, which was only one of many designs, and which most pirates only flew at the last moment, as a final declaration of intent just before the attack. What went up an hour before dawn was a lookout, a young man called Jem, 20 years old and the lightest and quickest climber on the ship, who went up the main mast in the pre-dawn dark with nothing but his hands and his feet and the rope between them, and settled into the crow's nest 80 feet above the deck to watch the horizon for what the captain needed to see. He could feel the ship moving under him before he could see the water. The sloop pitched differently at this height, the same motion magnified, the way a long stick swings wider at its tip than at its handle. He had been doing this for 3 years. He had stopped being afraid of the height sometime in the first year. What he had not stopped noticing was the view. The sky before dawn from the top of a mast in the Caribbean was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He would not have said this to anyone on the deck below. It was not the kind of thing you said. But he thought it every morning when the conditions were right. This is beautiful. This is one of the most beautiful things. Welcome back. If you're settling in for the night, good. You're in the right place. Tonight we're going somewhere that history has made famous and then proceeded to mostly get wrong. The Golden Age of Piracy, roughly 1690 to 1730, is one of those periods that has been turned into legend so thoroughly that the actual thing underneath the legend has become almost invisible. What did a pirate ship actually feel like to live on? What were the politics of it, the social rules, the daily reality of being a person who had chosen this particular and extreme way of making a living? What did the food taste like? What happened when someone got hurt? What did the captain actually do, and was he what the movies say he was? These are the questions. If you've got a moment, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means these stories keep happening. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because somewhere out there, it's always 3 in the morning. Now, let's go aboard. The sloop was called the Patience, which was either an irony or a joke, depending on who you asked, and most of the crew had stopped asking. She was 70 feet from bow to stern, 12 feet at her widest point, and she drew 7 feet of water, which was shallow enough to work in the shoals and inlets of the Caribbean and deep enough to carry the weight she needed to carry. She had 2 masts, the main mast and the foremast, and she could carry an enormous spread of sail for her size, which was why sloops were the preferred vessel of pirates in this period. They were fast, not invincible, not comfortable, but fast, and fast was what you needed when your entire strategy depended on closing the gap to your target before your target could close the distance to somewhere you couldn't follow. The Patience had 6 guns, 4 4-pounders, the main battery, the guns that could do real damage at medium range, and 2 swivel guns at the stern, small and maneuverable, more useful for discouraging pursuit or suppressing the deck of a vessel you were trying to board than for inflicting serious structural damage. The guns were the most valuable things on the ship. They were heavy, and they were expensive, and they were what made the whole enterprise possible. Without the guns, the Patience was just a fast boat. With the guns, she was a negotiating position. The crew of the Patience numbered 32 men and 1 woman, a fact that the woman in question, whose name was Mary, who was the ship's cook, and who had been sailing with this crew for 14 months under circumstances she declined to discuss in detail, had found to require more active management than she had expected. The management had been successful because she was a better cook than anyone else available, and because the captain, a man called Thomas Avery, no relation to the famous Henry Avery, a distinction he was tired of making, had decided with the pragmatism that characterized his leadership that a good cook was worth any amount of complication, and that the crew who disagreed could swim. Nobody had swum. The crew of 33 people was a cross-section of the Atlantic world in the early 18th century, which is to say it was more diverse than most historical narratives of the period acknowledge. There were men from England, Thomas the captain, 3 others from Bristol, 1 from Portsmouth, 1 who claimed to be from London but whose accent suggested something different. There were men from the American colonies, 2 from Virginia, 1 from Massachusetts Bay. There were several men who had come to piracy from the slave trade, black men who had either escaped enslavement and found their way onto pirate ships, which offered a kind of freedom that the colonial world otherwise denied, or who had been taken from captured slave ships and given the choice to join. The proportion of black sailors on pirate ships in this period was, according to the historical record, significantly higher than on Royal Navy vessels or merchant ships, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 in some well-documented crews. Their legal status on pirate ships was, nominally at least, equal to everyone else's, which was not the case anywhere else in the Atlantic world. This was one of the genuinely radical things about piracy in the Golden Age. The ships were, by the standards of their time, surprisingly democratic. Not perfectly democratic, not without hierarchy, but the hierarchy was different from the hierarchy of the world they had left. The way a pirate ship was governed in the early 18th century was something that contemporaries found bizarre and that historians have found genuinely interesting. The captain of a pirate ship was elected. He was elected by the crew, he served at the crew's pleasure, and he could be removed by a vote if the crew decided he was incompetent, cowardly, or otherwise unsuitable. This was not the way the Royal Navy worked. In the Royal Navy, a captain was appointed by the Admiralty, served for life or until court-martialed, and had essentially absolute authority over his crew, which included the authority to have men flogged, to confine them, and in extreme circumstances to hang them. The living and working conditions on Royal Navy ships of the early 18th century were bad enough that a significant portion of the men who became pirates had been Royal Navy sailors first, men who had served their country in a war and then been discharged or who had jumped ship, because the conditions were genuinely intolerable. Piracy was, for many of its practitioners, less a career criminal choice and more a labor action by men who had run out of other options. The pirate ship's constitution, and many pirate ships did have actual written articles, the ship's articles, which constituted a kind of contract between the captain and the crew, typically specified the captain's powers and their limits. The captain had full authority during battle. He commanded the chase. He decided when to fight and when to run and how to handle an enemy vessel. Outside of battle, his authority was more limited. Major decisions, whether to attack a particular vessel, where to put into port, how to distribute prizes, were made by vote of the full crew. Every man had a vote. Every man had a voice. If the captain lost the confidence of the crew could vote him out, which several notable pirates of this period experienced firsthand. The quartermaster, the second most important person on the ship, had a specific role in this system. He represented the crew's interests, managed the distribution of prizes, and served as a check on the captain's authority. If the captain was the executive, the quartermaster was something like the union rep and the chief financial officer combined. Gem came down from the mast as the sun came up, which it did in the Caribbean with the directness of a place that has not had sufficient time in the darkness. The transition from night to day in the Caribbean was not gradual. It was a decision. One moment the sky was dark, and then it was not, and the world was full of heat and light, and the particular blue of tropical water that people who have only seen the North Atlantic cannot quite believe is real. He climbed down to the deck and reported, "Nothing on the horizon." Thomas the captain nodded. Another morning then, another long stretch of open water without a prize. This was the reality of piracy that the legends skip. Most of the time, you were not attacking anything. You were sailing. You were watching. You were waiting. The Caribbean in 1698, 1712, 1720, depending on where in the Golden Age our story sits, was full of shipping, and the shipping lanes between the major colonial ports were busy enough that a small, fast vessel with appropriate intelligence about schedules and routes could be reasonably confident of finding opportunities. But reasonably confident was not the same as guaranteed, and the gaps between opportunities were filled with the ordinary life of the ship, which was not glamorous. The day on a pirate ship was organized, as it was on any sailing vessel of the period, by the watches. The watch system divided the crew into two groups, typically called the starboard watch and the larboard watch, who alternated responsibility for working the ship through 4-hour periods, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, through the day and through the night. A crew member slept when their watch was off, worked when it was on, and ate at the intervals that fell into this schedule. The system had the advantage of ensuring that the ship was always attended by half the crew. It had the disadvantage of ensuring that you were never quite fully rested, because 4-hour periods of sleep are not ideal sleep periods for human beings, and the quality of sleep available in the hold of a sloop, hot, smelling of bilge water and unwashed bodies, loud with the sound of the ship's working, was not ideal either. Most sailors in this period were chronically sleep-deprived. Not dramatically, not incapacitatingly, but persistently. The tiredness that comes from years of inadequate sleep becomes, in time, indistinguishable from your normal state, and the sailors who had been at sea for several years no longer had a clear memory of what it felt like to be fully rested. You slept in a hammock, suspended between two beams. Hammocks, introduced to European sailors from Caribbean indigenous people in the 16th century, were a genuine improvement over sleeping on the deck or on chests. They swung with the ship's motion rather than fighting it, which meant that a good sleeper could be rocked rather than thrown. They provided some separation from the deck, and they could be rolled up and stowed in the morning, clearing the deck space for work. On a pirate sloop with 33 people, sleeping space was at a premium. The hammocks were slung in the hold and between the guns, and in warm weather some of the crew slept on deck, wrapped in whatever they had, because the air above was so much better than the air below that the harder surface was worth it. Let us meet more of the Patience's crew. There was a man called Edward, who was 38 years old and who had been a merchant sailor for 15 years before joining the Patience, and who had made the transition, as many men of the period did, not in a single dramatic moment but gradually, through the accumulation of grievances that tends to precede a fundamental change in direction. Edward was the Patience's navigator. Navigation in the early 18th century was a combination of science, experience, and a certain amount of informed guessing. The tools available were the compass, the quadrant for measuring the altitude of the sun and stars, the chip log for estimating the ship's speed, the lead line for measuring depth, and the charts, which varied enormously in quality and accuracy. Dead reckoning, the method of tracking your position by keeping careful account of your speed and direction from a known starting point, was the primary technique. The difficulty was that errors accumulated. A slight mistake in estimating speed, compounded over days of sailing, could put you significantly off course. A current not accounted for could move you sideways without your knowing. The result was that even experienced navigators were sometimes uncertain of their position to within many miles, which in open ocean was tolerable and near a coast was terrifying. Edward had run aground once, on a merchant vessel, off the coast of Hispaniola, in conditions that should have been safe. He had not run aground since. The memory was sufficient. He kept his charts with a care that bordered on reverence, maintaining them in a waterproof case and checking them against his celestial observations whenever conditions allowed. He was not warm to people he didn't know. He was exactly the person you wanted in charge of where you were going. The food on the Patience was, by Royal Navy standards, marginally better. By any modern standard, it was marginal in almost every respect. Mary, the ship's cook, worked with what the ship had, which was principally salt meat, beef, and pork preserved in barrels of brine, which had to be soaked in fresh water before cooking to reduce the salt to a level that didn't make eating it an experience of purely punishing salinity. Ship's biscuit, which was a dense, flat, hard bread that kept for long periods without spoiling, and which, in the tropics, was invariably home to a particular species of weevil. The weevils were not surprising. They were expected. The question was not whether the biscuit contained weevils but what to do about them, and the standard answer was to knock the biscuit on the table before eating to encourage the weevils to leave, and to then eat quickly in the dark if the darkness was available. The dark was available often, because light on a ship at night was a fire hazard and was managed carefully. The salt meat was cooked in a large copper pot over the ship's galley fire, the one open flame that was kept on the ship and which was the single most fire-dangerous thing on a wooden vessel at sea. Mary managed this with the attention it required. She had never had a galley fire. She intended to maintain this record. What she could do with salt pork, ship's biscuit, dried peas, and the occasional fresh provision acquired at a friendly port was not what you would call cuisine in any elevated sense, but it was competent. She knew which combinations of spices, the small supply of dried herbs and peppers that the ship maintained, made the salt meat more than tolerable. She knew how to make a peas porridge that was filling and hot, and provided the caloric density that sustained men doing physical work in tropical heat. She knew which men would eat anything and which were particular, and she managed the latter with a patience that she had developed not in response to the work, but in spite of it. Fresh water was rationed. At sea for more than a few days, the supply of fresh water became one of the central organizing concerns of the ship. The barrels in which water was stored did not improve the water. After a week, the water in a ship's barrel tasted of the wood and sometimes of the things that grew in wood in warm, wet conditions. You drank it. You added rum if you had rum, which helped with the taste and with the microbial content in ways that the sailors understood practically without understanding the mechanism. The rum ration on a pirate ship was generous by the standards of the period, more generous than on Royal Navy ships, where the grog ration was controlled and moderate. On a pirate ship, the articles sometimes specified the rum allocation, and it was often considerable. This was, from a health standpoint, not entirely wrong. The alcohol killed things in the water that would otherwise have killed you. From a behavioral standpoint, it created other complications, particularly when the rum was available in large quantities, and the tension of long periods at sea with no prize found its outlet in the availability of alcohol. Thomas the captain managed this with the pragmatism of someone who knew that an unhappy crew could vote him out and that an incapacitated crew could not sail the ship. He walked the line. There is a misconception about pirates that movies and novels have made almost universal, and it is about the violence. The misconception is that pirates were primarily violent, that their method was the sword and the cannon, that they boarded ships through the smoke of naval battle and took what they found by force. The reality was considerably more nuanced, for reasons that were not humanitarian but practical. Violence was expensive. Violence damaged the prize. Violence risked the lives of the crew, who were not easily replaced and who had, as free men on an elected ship, considerably more say in whether violence occurred than the stories suggest. The actual preferred method of Golden Age pirates was terror rather than battle. The pirates' flag, the Jolly Roger, in whatever variant the individual ship's crew had chosen, was specifically designed to communicate information before any fighting happened. This ship is pirates. Resistance is futile. Surrender now, and you will be treated well. The commercial logic was simple. A merchant captain with a small crew and a valuable cargo, confronted with a fast, well-armed sloop flying a skull and crossbones, making demands by shouting across the water, that captain's rational choice was to surrender. He would lose the cargo, but he would keep his ship and his life. He would reach port eventually and make his report. The merchant company would absorb the loss, and the pirates would get the cargo without fighting. This worked more often than not. Many merchants surrendered without firing a shot, and many pirate captures involved no violence whatsoever. The violence happened, sometimes dramatically, sometimes brutally, when the logic failed, when a target resisted, when the political context changed. But the violence was not the business model. It was the failure condition of the business model. The morning after Jem's uneventful lookout, the patients spotted a sail. The reaction on deck was not the dramatic thing the movies suggest. It was quiet, focused, and efficient, the specific efficiency of people who had rehearsed this situation many times and who knew exactly what they were supposed to do. Jim, back in the crow's nest by afternoon, called down, "Sail northeast 3 miles running south." Thomas came on deck with his telescope. He looked for a long time. He said, "Merchant likely. Lugger rigged, probably out of New Providence or Hispaniola." The quartermaster, a Barbadian man called Jonas, who had the physical solidity of someone who had been loading and unloading cargo since he was 12, moved through the crew quietly, passing the word. No orders were shouted. The guns were made ready without ceremony. The course changed. The patience picked up speed. The pursuit, the chase, in the language of the period, was the most technically demanding part of a pirate operation because it required the navigator to make judgments about the target's course and speed and to plot an intercept that closed the distance before the target could escape or reach a port. Edward bent over his charts. He made calculations. He told Thomas what he thought. Thomas listened. He gave the helm order. The Patience moved. The chase lasted 3 hours. Not 3 hours of dramatic battle. 3 hours of sailing, of constant adjustment of course and sail to maintain and close the gap, of watching the target vessel make its own adjustments as it understood what was happening, of the particular psychological pressure that comes from being pursued at sea where there is nowhere to go. The target was a 2-masted brigantine called the Hannah, out of Port Royal with a cargo of sugar and rum, and some personal goods belonging to a merchant traveling as a passenger. The Hannah's captain, a Welshman named Owen, 42 years old, who had been sailing these waters for 15 years and who had never been taken by pirates and who had, until this afternoon, considered himself fortunate in this, watched the sloop behind him and made his calculation. The sloop was faster. The sloop was gaining. The nearest port was beyond reach. His crew was 9 men. The sloop, by his estimate, carried at least 30. He struck his colors, lowered his flag, the universal signal of surrender when the Patience was still half a mile behind him. Thomas saw the flag come down. He said quietly to nobody in particular, "There we are." The boarding of the Hannah was conducted with something approaching procedure. A boat was lowered, the Patience's small tender, and Jonas the quartermaster went across with 6 men, including Jem, who went partly because he was quick and partly because Jonas found his presence useful in the specific way that young men with uncomplicated expressions are sometimes useful when you are trying to convey non-threatening intentions. The Hannah's crew watched them come. Owen the captain met them at the rail. He was a composed man in difficult circumstances, which Jonas noted and appreciated. The conversation that followed was businesslike. Jonas explained what the Patience wanted: the cargo manifest, the personal goods, any cash or instruments of value. He explained what would happen to the Hannah's crew. They would not be harmed. They would not be made to join unless they chose to. They would be left with their ship and enough provisions to reach port. This was the standard offer. It was kept in most cases because keeping it was good policy. A reputation for keeping your word made future surrenders more likely. A reputation for violence made future targets resist, which was worse for everyone, including the pirates. The transfer of cargo took the rest of the afternoon. The Patience's crew worked the goods across in the tender, and the Hannah's crew, after an initial period of stiff, watchful tension, found themselves sometimes helping, in the way that people who have accepted an unavoidable situation find themselves cooperating with it. The merchant passenger, whose name was Arthur, a wool merchant from Bristol who was having the worst day of his commercial life, sat on a crate and watched his goods be transferred and tried to calculate whether the insurance would cover this and whether anyone would believe his account of events. Jonas saw him calculating and said, "You'll be fine." Arthur said, "I know that, I'm calculating the loss." Jonas said, "Fair enough." He left Arthur to his calculations. The division of prizes on a pirate ship followed rules that were specified in the articles and overseen by the quartermaster. The formula varied from ship to ship, but the general principle was consistent. Everyone got a share, and the shares were not equal but were allocated according to role and contribution. The captain received a captain's share, typically 1.5 or 2 shares of the common sailor's share, not the enormous privilege differential of Royal Navy command. The quartermaster, the navigator, the carpenter, the gunner, the specialists, received somewhat larger shares in recognition of their skills. Everyone else received 1 share. If a man had been particularly brave or useful in a specific action, extra allocation was possible. If a man was injured in the taking of a prize, lost a limb, lost an eye, the articles typically specified compensation from the common fund before the individual shares were distributed. This injury compensation was written into the pirate code at a time when no equivalent insurance existed in the legitimate maritime world. It was the only disability insurance many of these men would ever have access to. Let us spend time with 2 more members of the Patience's crew, because the diversity of the ship is one of the things about it that the history books least often convey. The first is a man called Kofi, who was 27 years old and who had come to the Patience from a slaving ship, specifically from the hold of a slaving ship, having been taken from his home on the Gold Coast and transported across the Atlantic under conditions that he declined to describe in detail. The slaving ship had been taken by pirates 3 days before its arrival in the Caribbean. The pirates, a different crew on a different ship, not the Patience, had taken the cargo and put the question to the enslaved people in the hold, join or not. Kofi had joined. He had joined with the specific intention of becoming the kind of person who could not be taken from his home and transported in a hold, which meant becoming a person with a weapon and a crew who would use it. He had been at sea for 4 years. He was one of the most capable seamen on the Patience. He could tell the weather from the feel of the wind in a way that Edward the Navigator grudgingly respected. He did not talk about the Gold Coast. He thought about it privately, with a quality of attention that was neither grief nor hope, but some third thing that did not have an English word for it, and might not have had a word in his own language either. The second is a man called Samuel, who was 61 years old and who was the oldest man on the ship and who performed, at this age, the function of carpenter, the person responsible for the structural maintenance of the vessel and for responding to damage. The carpenter on a ship in this period was more important than the title might suggest. A ship that was taking on water could sink. The carpenter was the person who decided whether a hole in the hull was manageable or catastrophic, who patched the hull in ways that kept the water out long enough to reach safety, who maintained the pumps that removed water from the bilge, and who understood the wooden structure of the ship in the way that only someone who had spent years living inside it could understand. Samuel had been a ship's carpenter on 4 ships before the Patience. He had never lost a ship to structural failure. He was laconic in the way of people who have seen a great deal and found that most of it did not require comment. He carved things in his off-watch hours, small wooden figures, sailors and fish and birds, which he gave to other members of the crew for reasons he did not explain. Everyone on the ship had at least one of Samuel's carvings. The health of the crew was one of the most significant practical constraints on a pirate operation, and the most common cause of death among Golden Age pirates was not battle. It was disease, dysentery, malaria, scurvy, which resulted from the deficiency of vitamin C in the diet. A diet of salt meat and ship's biscuit could be sustained for months without fresh fruit and vegetables, and the gradual decline of a man with scurvy is one of the more miserable progressions in maritime history. First the fatigue and the irritability, then the bleeding gums, then the joints, then the inability to heal, then worse things. The Patience's surgeon, a man called Daniel, who had trained as a barber surgeon before taking to sea, was not a physician in the modern sense. He knew how to set bones and amputate limbs and dress wounds. He knew the symptoms of the common diseases and the treatments that the medical tradition of his time recommended, which were not always wrong and were not always right. He had a medicine chest which contained preparations of varying effectiveness. He could not prevent scurvy. He could recognize it, and when he recognized it, his strongest treatment was to find fresh fruit, specifically limes or lemons, though he did not understand why these worked, only that they did as quickly as possible. This meant putting into a port or a friendly island, which meant exposing the ship to risks of its own. The management of health and supply on a pirate ship was a continuous negotiation between what the ship needed and what it could safely get. Port visits were the most dangerous and the most anticipated moments in the life of a pirate crew. Dangerous because every port was a potential trap, a place where the colonial authorities might have received intelligence about the ship, where a naval vessel might be waiting, where the welcome that a crew expected might turn out to be organized hostility. Anticipated because a port meant fresh food and fresh water and solid ground, and people who were not the 32 other people you had been living with at close quarters for months. The ports that served pirates in this period were specific places with specific characters. Nassau in the Bahamas, New Providence, was for much of the Golden Age a pirate haven, a place where the colonial authority was weak enough, and the economic interest in the pirate trade strong enough that ships like the Patience could put in with reasonable confidence. The taverns of Nassau were the social spaces where the Golden Age of Piracy lived and breathed, where crews traded information, where new men were recruited, where prizes were sold, where deals were made. They were loud and crowded and dangerous, and they smelled of rum and sweat and the sea. The merchants of Nassau who bought goods from pirates without asking too many questions were the hidden infrastructure of the whole enterprise, the shoreside network that made the seaside operation economically viable. Without the fences, without the buyers, without the port officials who could be persuaded to look elsewhere for an afternoon, piracy as a business model did not work. It was always a collaborative enterprise between the people on the ships and the people on the shore. Mary cooked the evening meal after the Hannah's cargo had been transferred, and the Hannah had been allowed to continue on its way, somewhat lighter but otherwise intact. She cooked with provisions from the Hannah's stores, which were considerably better than the Patience's standing supply. Fresh pork, not yet salted, vegetables that had been at sea only since Port Royal, rum in a quality that the Patience's supply did not match. She made something that deserved to be called a meal rather than simply sustenance. The crew ate it with the particular intensity of people who have been eating badly for a while and are suddenly eating well. Thomas ate with the crew as he usually did. The pirate ship did not have a separate officer's mess. The captain ate with his men. He heard what they talked about. He knew what the mood was. This was part of the governance. The captain's authority was personal and present, not bureaucratic and distant. He ate Mary's food and he listened. The mood tonight was good. The prize had been small. The Hannah's cargo was worth something but not a fortune, but it was something, and something after weeks of nothing felt like more than it was. He would have to manage expectations. He would do that tomorrow. Tonight he ate pork and listened to his crew talk. The nights at sea, away from any port, were some of the strangest and some of the most beautiful experiences available to a human being in the early 18th century. No light pollution, no sound from any source except the ship and the sea. The darkness of the open Caribbean on a moonless night was total in a way that no one who has grown up with electric light can quite imagine. Not terrifying, but absolute. The stars in that darkness were the only source of information about the shape of the world beyond the ship. Jem, who came off watch at midnight and was not yet tired enough to sleep, sat on the bow and looked at them. He was not a man of much formal education. He had grown up in Bristol, the son of a dock worker, and had gone to sea at 15 and had been at sea ever since and had spent 3 years of those years on this particular ship. He had no particular plan for the future. The future was something he thought about in general rather than specific terms. He wanted to be alive in it, and to have some money in it, and beyond that the specifics seemed like the province of people who had more choices than he did. What he had instead of plans was the present moment, the stars above the Caribbean, the ship beneath him, the sound of the water against the hull, the feeling of being alive in his body, which at 20 was a reliable feeling and one he had not yet learned to take for granted. He sat on the bow and looked at the stars. They were, he thought, extremely good stars. The Golden Age of Piracy ended for most practical purposes around 1720 to 1730, when the English authorities made a concerted and largely successful effort to suppress it. The legal instrument was the Piracy Act of 1718, which established vice-admiralty courts in the colonies, with the power to try and execute pirates without sending them back to England for trial, which had been expensive and slow and unreliable. The political will was the perception, by the English government, that piracy had become a genuine threat to the expanding colonial commercial system, that the trade routes that were generating enormous wealth were being disrupted to a degree that required military rather than police solutions. The naval response was effective. The number of major pirates operating in the Caribbean fell dramatically in the 1720s. The famous names Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane, Calico Jack, and Bonnie Mary Read all came to their ends in this period, either executed or dead in combat or captured. The era ended, not because the men and women who had chosen it had changed their minds, but because the world around them had changed in ways that made the choice less viable. The ports that had been friendly became hostile. The buyers who had been willing became cautious. The odds, which had never been good, got worse. The Patience was not one of the famous ships. Thomas Avery was not one of the famous names. The ship's history, if it has a history in any archive which is not certain, would be a few mentions in colonial records, a report or two from vessels it had taken, perhaps a deposition from a captured merchant. This is appropriate. The Golden Age of Piracy was not made of famous names. It was made of 33 people on a sloop, and the day after the Hannah, and the morning watch, and the afternoon heat, and Mary's cooking, and Jem's stars. It was made of Kofi thinking about something that did not have a word in any language he knew. It was made of Samuel carving small wooden birds in the few quiet minutes between one thing and the next. It was made of Edward keeping his charts dry and calculating the distance to the next anchorage and the depth of the water there, and whether it was safe to go. These people are gone, as completely as the Golden Age itself is gone, but they were real. They lived on water and ate salt meat and slept in hammocks and looked at the stars from the bow of a fast ship in the Caribbean. They made a world out of what they had. Let us go back to the ship's articles, because they deserve more attention. The articles, the written contract that governed the Patience and ships like her, were not a radical political document in the sense that their authors were theorizing democracy. They were a practical document in the sense that the men who drew them up had identified, from experience, the things that needed to be specified to prevent the ship from becoming ungovernable. And the things that needed to be specified turned out to require something that looked, from the outside, remarkably like a working democracy. The Patience's articles, drawn up when the ship was taken and the new crew was assembled, and agreed to by every man who signed on, under the assumption that a man who signed the articles and then violated them could be held to account by the rest of the crew, specified the following roughly. The captain to have full authority at sea and in battle, the quartermaster to represent the crew's interests and to manage the distribution of prizes. All prizes to be divided according to the established formula. Injury compensation to be paid from the common stock before distribution of shares. No fighting among the crew, disputes to be settled by the quartermaster or, if necessary, by a duel ashore under controlled conditions. No gambling for stakes that could not be paid. Lights out at 8 in the evening in the common areas, those who wish to drink after that hour to do so on deck. No women or boys to be brought aboard, a rule that the presence of Mary violated technically, though the consensus of the crew was that Mary was a different category of person, being the cook rather than a romantic companion. These rules were not especially liberal by modern standards. But in the context of the early 18th century Atlantic, a ship where every man voted and disputes were adjudicated rather than simply resolved by a captain's fist, was genuinely unusual. The Royal Navy hanged men for looking at an officer the wrong way. The patients debated disagreements with the quartermaster as mediator. The difference was not small. Thomas Avery had been a sailor since he was 11 years old. He had learned the sea on merchant ships operating out of Bristol, the coastal trade first, the Atlantic trade after, and he had accumulated over 27 years a knowledge of ships and of the sea that was entirely embodied. He could not have told you in formal terms how to sail a sloop. He could sail one in conditions that would defeat most people who could tell you how. He had made the transition to piracy at 31, after a merchant venture had failed badly enough that the debts attached to his name made returning to legitimate maritime employment in Bristol a complicated prospect. He had joined a pirate crew as an ordinary sailor. He had risen to quartermaster, and then to captain of the Patience after the previous captain had been voted out, a process that Thomas had managed with the quiet political effectiveness of someone who understood that getting what you wanted in a democratic system required building coalitions before the vote, not during it. He was not violent by temperament. He was practical. He assessed risk the way a navigator assessed a coastline, with attention to the places where things could go wrong, and with a strong preference for routes that had been proven by others before him. He was also lonely in the specific way of leaders whose authority separates them from the ease of ordinary companionship. He sat with the crew and ate with the crew and listened to the crew. But he was also always slightly apart from them, the slight remove of the person whose decisions everyone felt the consequences of, whose approval everyone was aware of seeking. This was the cost of command in a system where your authority came from the people you commanded. You were with them and not with them simultaneously. He had made his peace with this. He had not entirely made his peace with this. The physical experience of living on a sloop for months at a time was, by any modern metric, uncomfortable. The ship was 70 feet long. It was 12 feet wide. 33 people lived on it. The mathematics of space allocation left each person with less room than a large wardrobe. In practice, the spaces were shared in shifts. The hammocks emptied by one watch became available to the other, and the deck added a significant amount of effective living space in good weather. But the hold, where most sleeping happened and where the supplies were stored, and where the smell of the bilge accumulated, was genuinely unpleasant. The bilge was the lowest part of the ship's interior, where water that came aboard through leaks or over the deck collected before being pumped out. It smelled of salt water and wood rot, and the things that grew in combinations of salt water and wood rot in tropical temperatures. Samuel, the carpenter, monitored the bilge level carefully, because the rate of bilge accumulation told you things about the ship's condition that no other instrument could tell you as clearly. A ship that was making water faster than it should be was a ship with a problem. The smell you got used to. The sound of the pumps, which were operated manually, regularly, as standard maintenance, was one of the defining sounds of life aboard, the rhythmic clank and suck that was the ship's pulse. Everyone took turns at the pumps. It was not the worst work on the ship. It was also not the best. Jem had grown up wanting to be exactly what he was. This was rarer than it sounds, and he knew it. And it was a source of quiet satisfaction that he did not often examine directly, because examining things directly was not in his nature, but which was there nonetheless. He had grown up on the docks of Bristol, and the docks of Bristol were full of ships and full of stories about ships, and the ships that had the most interesting stories were the ships that came from nowhere official and went nowhere approved, and whose cargo manifests, if they had them, were works of creative fiction. He had wanted to be on one of those ships. He was on one of those ships. He was 20 years old, and he was the best climber on the ship, and he had been told by Jonas, the quartermaster, that his share of the Hannah prize would be enough to buy new boots in Nassau, which was a calculation he found satisfying. He did not think about what came after the boots. He thought about the boots. This was, at 20 in the early 18th century on a pirate sloop in the Caribbean, the appropriate horizon. The language of a pirate ship in this period was a sea language, which was a dialect of English that had incorporated words and phrases from every port it had ever visited and every culture that contributed to the crew. It was incomprehensible to landspeople. It had its own words for the parts of the ship, for the maneuvers, for the weather conditions, for the social situations that arose frequently enough to have required a label. It had words for specific kinds of storms and specific kinds of winds and specific qualities of light on specific bodies of water. It had a vocabulary for the relationship between a sailing vessel and the wind that required dozens of precise terms, because the dozen or so relevant angles and combinations mattered and needed to be communicated without ambiguity in situations where ambiguity could kill you. Kofi had learned this language in 4 years. He had learned it because it was necessary, because navigating the ship required it, and because the alternative was to remain on the outside of the crew's primary communication. He had learned it with the specific aptitude of someone who had already proven, by surviving the middle passage and the weeks in a hold, and the moment when the pirates came, and the question was put to him, that he could learn what needed to be learned in extremely adverse conditions. The sea language had become his third language. His first was the language of his home. His second was the trade language of the West African coast that had been the medium of the commerce that had destroyed his life. His third was this. He used all three of them in different contexts for different things. He was the only person on the ship who thought in 3 languages. Nobody on the ship knew this. The medical emergency on the patients happened 3 weeks after the Hannah, when a man called Pierce, one of the Bristol men, 24 years old, who had been climbing rigging since he was 14, fell from the yard arm during a squall in rough conditions and landed on the deck rather than in the water. He was alive when Daniel, the surgeon, got to him. He was not in a condition that made survival obviously likely. The leg was broken in 2 places badly. There was damage to his side that Daniel assessed with his hands and his experience and his best judgment, reaching conclusions that he believed were correct and that may or may not have been. He set the leg. The setting of a badly broken leg without anesthetic, with only the rum that could be poured down the patient's throat in sufficient quantity before the work began, and the leather belt pressed between the teeth, and the 3 men holding Pierce down, was an experience that nobody on the deck who witnessed it soon forgot. Pierce screamed. He passed out during the setting. When he came back, he was very pale, and Daniel had splinted the leg and bound the side and put the man in the best position available on a ship, which was the hammock nearest the stern where the motion was least. Pierce lived. Not because of anything Daniel did that was particularly sophisticated. Because the break had not damaged anything vital, and because the infection that could have killed him did not take hold, which was partly luck and partly the rum-soaked dressings and partly Pierce's own constitution. He was on his back for 3 weeks. He was miserable for 3 weeks. He received more care from the crew around him than the crew would have acknowledged providing: extra food, extra water, someone checking on him in the night, Samuel carving him a small figure of a man on a mast, which Pierce received with more emotion than he intended to display. The community of a pirate ship was, in this way, like any community under pressure. It revealed, in difficulty, capacities for mutual support that the normal routine did not always make visible. The question of what drove men, and the occasional woman, to piracy in the Golden Age is a question that the historical record addresses imperfectly, because the people who made this choice did not typically leave explanatory documents. But from the records we have, the trial transcripts, the deposition of captured pirates, the accounts of merchants who dealt with them, the rare pirate autobiographies, some patterns emerge. Many came from the merchant marine and the Royal Navy. The working conditions of both were genuinely terrible. A common sailor on a merchant vessel in the early 18th century was badly paid, badly fed, subject to arbitrary discipline, and had very little recourse if the master was incompetent or cruel. A common sailor in the Royal Navy was somewhat better paid and somewhat more constrained, but the arbitrary discipline was if anything more severe. Flogging was commonplace, and the gap between the living standards of officers and common sailors was vast. Piracy, by comparison, offered better shares of the profits of your labor, more say in how the operation was run, better food when prizes were taken, and the specific freedom of being answerable to a crew rather than to an institution. It also offered, as all outlaw lives offer, the freedom of having stepped outside the social order entirely, of no longer being subject to debts, to legal proceedings, to the status hierarchy of the legitimate world. The price was that you were now on the wrong side of the largest naval power in the Atlantic, and the trend line was not going in a good direction. Most pirates in this period were dead or imprisoned within 5 years of beginning. The expected lifespan of a Golden Age pirate was not long. They knew this. They did it anyway. There is something recognizable in that calculation: the trading of security for freedom, the betting on the short term over the long term, the decision that the quality of the present was worth the uncertainty of the future. It is not the decision most people make, but it is a decision that most people understand. The evening before the patients reached Nassau, with the Hannah's cargo processed and the shares calculated, and the mood of the crew elevated by the prospect of solid ground and fresh food, and the particular pleasures of a port that knew how to receive them, Thomas Avery sat at the stern in the last light and thought about nothing in particular. He was good at this. He had developed the capacity to think about nothing, to sit with the evening and the sound of the water and the particular orange of the western sky before dark, as a necessary counterweight to the constant calculation that command required. He thought about Bristol. He thought about it the way he always thought about it, as a place he had left, not as a place he wanted to go back to, but as the origin point from which the rest of his life had been distance. He thought about the distance. He was not sure if it was the right distance. He was not sure that the question was useful. The sky went orange and then deep red and then the dark came, which it did quickly in these latitudes decisively. The first stars appeared. Somewhere behind him on the deck, Jonas was talking to Kofi about something, their voices low, occasional laughter. Mary was cleaning the galley, the specific sounds of a cook reclaiming order from the mess of cooking. Samuel was in the hold. Jem would be in his hammock. The ship moved on the dark water toward Nassau and toward solid ground and toward whatever came next, which was not yet determined and would not be until it was. Thomas watched the stars. The stars were, as always, indifferent and magnificent. Nassau in the early 1700s was a place that defied easy description. It was a port town on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, and it had the specific character of places where official authority is weak and unofficial activity has filled the vacuum. The colonial governor of the Bahamas was, for much of the Golden Age, either absent, ineffectual, or actively complicit in the trade that the pirates brought to the island. The merchants of Nassau had an economic interest in the goods that pirate ships brought, which were cheaper than legitimate goods, and which were exchanged for provisions and equipment and information that the pirates needed. The tavern keepers had an economic interest in the spending of men who had been at sea for months, and who arrived in port with shares of prizes burning a hole in their pockets, and a powerful need for rum and company. The prostitutes and their managers had an obvious economic interest. The ship repairers and the chandlers, the suppliers of naval stores, rope, canvas, tar, wood, had an economic interest. The whole town's economy was, in a sense, underwritten by piracy, even for the people who would not have identified themselves as participants in it. This is how illegal economies work in places where the legitimate economy is thin. They become the water that everything swims in. The patients arrived in Nassau at mid-morning, dropping anchor in the harbor alongside 3 other vessels whose character was not difficult to read. The town's waterfront had a specific smell: the sea, and tar, and rum, and wood smoke from the cook fires, and the general fragrance of a place that was doing a lot of business and not paying a great deal of attention to ventilation. The crew came ashore in 2 groups, because Thomas had decided that leaving no one on the ship was not wise, and he managed the rotation so that everyone got time ashore and the ship was never entirely unattended. He was last off. He walked up the main street of Nassau, and it smelled like money and risk and the particular freedom of a place that had decided not to ask too many questions, and he thought, "This will not last." He was right. It lasted another few years, but it would not last. What happened in Nassau on a cruise first night ashore is something that the historical record gestures at without describing in detail, which is itself informative. The rum was consumed in quantities that made the morning difficult. Goods were sold, information was exchanged, new men were assessed as potential recruits. The personal goods taken from the Hannah, the merchant Arthur's traveling luggage, mainly, found their way to a buyer whose relationship to legitimate commerce was the same as Nassau's. Complicated. Jem bought his boots. They were not what he had imagined. They were better. He walked back from the cobblers in boots that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing, and the improvement over what he had been wearing was so immediate and so total that he stood in the street for a moment and appreciated it. Good boots. Extremely good boots. The simple pleasures available in a pirate port in the early 18th century were, when you had been deprived of them for long enough, genuinely pleasurable. A meal that was not salt meat, a drink served in a glass rather than a cup, the feeling of ground that did not move. These are small things. They were not small. Edward the Navigator spent his time in Nassau in a way that the rest of the crew found slightly eccentric, and that Edward found entirely natural. He went to find charts. He collected charts the way some men collected debts. He paid for them when they were for sale. He copied them when they were not, asking permission that was sometimes granted. He traded information. His knowledge of conditions on the route they had just sailed, the depth of water in a particular harbor, the behavior of the current at a particular season, for the information he needed. The charts of the Caribbean in the early 18th century were imperfect documents. They were the best available representations of a geography that was still being fully mapped, and they varied enormously in accuracy and in what they chose to show. A chart drawn by someone who had actually sailed the waters it depicted was worth considerably more than a chart drawn in a London office from other charts, which was a common method of chart production in this period. Edward could usually tell the difference. He bought 3 charts in Nassau. He was happy. He was, as Jonas once said with a certain respect, the only man he had ever met who was made genuinely happy by a piece of paper with lines on it. The recruit who joined the patients in Nassau was a young man named Felipe, who was 17 and who was from Havana, the son of a Spanish merchant, and who had been in Nassau for 2 months following a disagreement with his father that he declined to characterize in detail, beyond saying that the disagreement had been comprehensive. He spoke Spanish, and a rapid, heavily accented English, and enough Portuguese to manage in a Portuguese-speaking port. He was put to work in the rigging, where his age and his reflexes served him well. Jem showed him the crow's nest on the second day out of Nassau, and Felipe went up with the confidence of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of the height, which was different from Jem's hard-won indifference to it. Jem watched him from below. He thought, he'll be fine. He was right. Felipe was extremely good in the rigging within 3 months. He was also, within 3 months, the person on the ship who most visibly enjoyed his work, which was a quality the crew responded to without ever quite identifying what they were responding to. He made the work look like what it actually was for him, something he had chosen to do in a place where people could not stop him from choosing it. The weather in the Caribbean was one of the defining features of life there, not just for pirates, but for everyone who lived and worked and sailed in those waters. The hurricane season ran from June through November, and it produced conditions that made the open Atlantic look benign by comparison. A Caribbean hurricane in the early 18th century, with no warning systems, no satellites, no radio, no network of weather stations to track the approaching storm, was something you encountered rather than prepared for. The signs were available to experienced eyes. The quality of the swell, the color of the sky, the behavior of seabirds. The pressure changes that Kofi could feel in his joints and in the air before most other indicators appeared. Thomas had survived 2 hurricanes. Both times, survival had depended on a combination of good judgment, early recognition, and the specific quality of the patient's construction. Her shallow draft allowing her to run into the shallows of an island that a larger vessel could not have reached, where the water was calmer and the wind somewhat broken by the island's mass. Both times afterward, Thomas had sat with the aftermath and thought about probability. He was not a religious man. But in the way of people who have been very close to death more than once, he had a relationship with contingency that was somewhat like the relationship of religious people with the divine. A constant awareness that the things he depended on were not, ultimately, under his control. He sailed anyway. This is the only thing to do, when you have come to this understanding and not been broken by it. The relationship between pirates and their targets in the Golden Age was more complicated than the simple predator-prey dynamic that the legend proposes. Some merchant captains were terrified of pirates. Some were relatively philosophical about the risk, having made sufficient provisions in their cargo valuation and their insurance to absorb the loss as a cost of doing business in certain trade routes. Some had personal relationships with specific pirates that were not entirely adversarial. The case of Owen, the Welsh captain of the Hannah, is instructive. He had surrendered promptly, been treated correctly, and lost his cargo without incident. He reached Port Royal a week late with a story that, in the taverns of the port, came out as something less than a disaster and somewhat more than an adventure. He was not the first captain to notice, and privately acknowledge, that the specific pirates who had taken him were operating within a code of conduct that the code of, say, a Royal Navy press gang did not always match. The press gang would come aboard your vessel and take your men, take them, without their consent, and leave you undermanned and unable to sail. The pirates had taken his cargo and left his crew intact. He was not going to say this in his official deposition. His official deposition described the pirates as threatening and the encounter as terrifying. This was true in the way that all encounters with people who can kill you are true, but it was not the complete truth. The complete truth was more nuanced and less useful to the authorities who received his deposition. The skills required to sail a small vessel in the open Caribbean were not skills that everyone who ended up on a pirate ship had before they arrived. The Golden Age recruited from the general population of the Atlantic world, which included many people with minimal maritime experience. These people had to learn. The learning happened through the mechanism of being on a ship and needing to do things that needed to be done. The experienced sailors, men like Edward, like Kofi, like Samuel, like the older Bristol hands, taught not because they had been assigned to teach, but because the alternative was a ship crewed by people who couldn't sail it. This was a strong motivation. The teaching was not formal. It was observational, practical, and sometimes sharply critical. You watched. You did. You were corrected. You did it again. The correction was not gentle when the mistake was dangerous. The correction was not cruel when the mistake was simply new. The distinction between what was dangerous and what was merely unfamiliar was something the experienced sailors made automatically, and it was, in its way, a kind of pedagogy. Felipe, in his first month, made the mistake of not securing a line properly. The line came free in a gust of wind. Nothing catastrophic happened, but what could have happened was clear to everyone on deck. Kofi secured the line and told Felipe what he had done wrong and what the correct procedure was. His delivery was direct and without warmth. It was also without contempt, which is a distinction that matters enormously in the transmission of knowledge. Felipe listened. He secured lines correctly from that day. He told Jem later that Kofi was the best teacher on the ship. Jem said he's also the best sailor. Felipe said, is that how it works? Jem said, usually. The question of music on a pirate ship is one that the historical record addresses primarily in the context of the articles, which sometimes specified that the ship was entitled to the services of musicians on certain days. Music was not a luxury on a ship. It was a practical tool. Sea shanties, the work songs that coordinated the labor of pulling ropes and raising sails and pumping bilges, were functional music in the most direct sense. The rhythm organized the effort, the lyrics signaled when to pull and when to rest. The communal singing created the synchronized timing that made it possible for a group of men to exert maximum combined force in the same moment. A crew that couldn't sing together couldn't work together as effectively. This was understood, if not in precisely those terms. The patients had a fiddler, as it happened, a man called Reggie, who was English and who played an instrument that had survived 3 ships and considerable weather, and who was considered by the crew to be one of their more valuable assets. Reggie played for work when work songs were needed. He played for the evenings when the day was done and the mood required something else. He played for the moments when someone was sick or injured, and the music was the most useful thing available. He was not paid extra for this. It was simply what he did. The music he played was a mixture of English and Irish and Scottish and West African and Caribbean influences, absorbed from the crew around him over years of playing for mixed-culture audiences, and it had evolved into something that did not belong entirely to any single tradition. It was the music of this ship, of these people, in this moment of the Atlantic world. It was not preserved. It was not written down. It existed while Reggie played it and dissolved into the air when he stopped. This is the fate of most music. Let us return one more time to Mary. The cook's position on a pirate ship was not a coveted one. It involved genuine labor, the heat of the galley, the weight of the provisions, the repetitive physical work of preparing food for 33 people, under conditions that a shoreside kitchen would find challenging, on a moving platform over a fire that could not be allowed to become uncontrolled. Mary had a particular relationship with this work. She had come to it not as her original plan. Her original plan, to the extent that she had had one at 17 in a port city in England, had been different, more conventional, more directed toward the ordinary arc of a woman's life in the early 18th century. The specific chain of events that had led from that plan to the galley of the Patience was her private business, and she had declined to share it in detail, and the crew had accepted this in the pragmatic way that people on ships accept the histories of their shipmates as given rather than explained. What she had found in the work was something she had not expected, a domain. The galley was hers. Not as property, nothing on the ship was anyone's property in that sense. But as a sphere of authority and expertise, the galley was hers in the way that the mast was Jem's and the charts were Edward's. She understood it completely. She knew what she could make from any combination of supplies, what the limits of the fire allowed, how to stretch provisions that were running low into meals that sustained rather than simply delayed the crew's hunger. She knew the crew's preferences. She knew which men had problems with their teeth, an extremely common issue among sailors, the diet of salt and sugar and hard bread not being kind to enamel, and adjusted her preparations accordingly. She knew who was hungrier than usual, which was often an early sign of illness. She was, in a sense, the ship's most attentive observer of human welfare because feeding people requires knowing them. She had not chosen this role. She had found it, and she had decided somewhere in the first year that it was hers. The Patience did not survive the Golden Age. No single documented fate can be assigned to a fictional ship. But the statistical probability is that she was eventually taken by a naval patrol, by arrival, by weather, by the slow attrition of wear and storm and the accumulated damage that all wooden ships accumulate, and that her crew scattered or were captured and tried, and that some of them were hanged, and some were transported, and some simply disappeared into the port towns of the Atlantic world and found other lives. Thomas might have accepted a pardon. The general pardon offered in 1718 was taken by many pirates, including major figures like Benjamin Hornigold, who subsequently became a pirate hunter. Edward might have returned to the legitimate maritime world, his navigational skills too valuable to waste, his past perhaps sufficiently obscured by time and distance. Kofi's fate is the most uncertain, because his situation was the most precarious. a black man without legal documentation of his freedom, in a world where that status was assumed to be slavery, faced risks that the white members of the crew did not. He might have found his way to a place, certain communities in the Caribbean, certain ports, certain free black settlements, where his status could be established and maintained. Or he might not have. Jem might have kept sailing. He seems like someone who would have kept sailing. Mary, it is impossible to say, because women who disappeared from the historical record of the maritime world disappeared very completely, and there is no convenient trail to follow. She was there. She fed 33 people for 14 months. She did her job exactly right. She is gone. The Jolly Roger deserves its own careful attention, because the flag and its mythology are almost inseparable from the popular image of piracy, and because the reality is more interesting than the myth. The skull and crossbones was not the universal flag of Golden Age pirates. It was one design among many. Bartholomew Roberts, arguably the most successful pirate of the Golden Age by volume of prizes taken, flew a flag showing himself and death sharing a goblet. Blackbeard Edward Teach, whose reputation was so carefully cultivated that he reportedly tied slow-burning fuses into his beard before battle so that smoke wreathed his face like something demonic, flew a flag showing a skeleton spearing a heart. Emanuel Wynne may have flown one of the earliest recorded skull and crossbones flags. Each crew designed their own. The design communicated information that the design was chosen to communicate. We are serious. We are not going away. This will not end well for you if you resist. The red flag, sometimes called the Jolly Rouge, which may or may not be the etymology of Jolly Roger, was in some accounts more feared than the black flag. The black flag meant surrender, and you will be treated according to the articles. The red flag meant no quarter, no mercy, no prisoners. The choice of which flag to fly was itself a communication, and flying the red flag was typically the last resort, the signal deployed when the target had been firing on the pirate ship, and the captain had decided that the calculation had changed. The flags were not manufactured by a specialist supplier. They were made on the ship. The black fabric, the white or bone-colored paint or stitching. Someone on every pirate ship had made the decision about what the design should be, and someone else had executed it. The craft of making a flag that was meant to terrify was itself a perfectly ordinary act of sewing and painting, done in the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon, by people who were not particularly dramatic about it. The experience of crossing the line, the equator, was a landmark event for sailors on any vessel making north-south passages, and the ceremony associated with it was elaborate, maritime-specific, and almost certainly unpleasant for first-timers. The crossing the line ceremony involved the initiation of anyone crossing the equator for the first time into the order of those who had crossed it before. The older sailors played the roles of Neptune's court. The first-timers were subjected to various indignities. The specific details varied by ship and era, but the general principle was the same: a ritual humiliation that was also a welcome, a hazing that was also a recognition. You went through it and came out the other side as someone who had crossed the line. It was one of those rituals whose meaning is primarily in the having done it. Felipe crossed the equator on his third voyage with the Patience. He went through the ceremony with the dignified resignation of someone who has been told exactly what is coming and has decided that being dignified about it is better than the alternative. Jem, who had crossed the line twice before, played one of the minor roles in Neptune's court. He was, he felt, considerably more generous than the people who had played the same role at his initiation. He may have been right about this. He may have simply been misremembering. The question of the famous female pirates of the Golden Age, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, is one that deserves attention here, because the history is extraordinary and the reality is different from most tellings of it. Anne Bonny was an Irish woman who ended up in Nassau, became involved with the pirate captain Calico Jack Rackham, and sailed with his crew, reportedly fighting beside the men when the ship was taken in 1720, when, by several accounts, Most of the male crew were too drunk to resist effectively. Mary Read was an English woman who had spent much of her life presenting as a man. She had served in the military as a man, had worked as a sailor as a man, and was on Calico Jack's ship when it was taken. Whether Mary Read knew about Mary or Anne Bonny about herself, or whether the crew as a whole knew about either, is a matter of historical discussion. The court records of their trial in Jamaica in 1720 are the primary sources. Both women were sentenced to hang. Both pleaded pregnancy, which stayed the execution. Anne Bonny's fate after that is unknown. Mary Read died in prison, apparently of fever. Their story does not have a good ending. Most stories from the Golden Age do not. But the story itself, two women who found, in the radical democracy of a pirate ship, a space that the rest of the world denied them, is one that the period's history would not offer easily in any other context. Mary the cook of the Patience was not Anne Bonny. She was not sailing with a lover. She was doing a job, but the space she had found, the galley, the domain, the ship that had accepted her because she could feed it, was in its own way the same kind of space. A place where she was valued for what she could do rather than for what she was. Let us go back to the Caribbean night, because the Caribbean night is where this story is best told. The Patience at sea, 3 weeks out of Nassau, the prize of the Hannah weeks behind them, the next prize not yet found. The watch has changed. The starboard watch is on deck. The larboard watch is in their hammocks, or trying to be, in the heat of the hold. The stars are out in the way they are only out in the tropics, and only in a time before electric light. Completely, overwhelmingly, the whole dome of sky so thick with stars that the dark between them seems like the minority. Kofi is at the helm. He is thinking about something. We will not know what he is thinking about. The historical record does not extend to the private thoughts of a man like Kofi, and the fiction we are telling is not going to pretend to know. But he is standing at the helm, feeling the ship respond to the wind and the water in his hands, and the stars are above him, and the water is dark below, and the ship is moving. This is what is certain. He is alive. He is free, in the specific sense of that word that only applies when you remember what the alternative was. He is good at what he does. He is here. These are not small things. He holds the helm steady. The Patience moves on the dark water, and the stars move slowly overhead, and somewhere in the hold, Reggie's fiddle produces a few quiet notes, someone playing for themselves rather than for an audience, and the notes come up through the deck and dissolve into the night air. And then there is just the sound of the water and the sound of the wind, and the sound of a ship that is going somewhere, though exactly where has not yet been determined. The end of the Golden Age came from several directions at once. The political will of the English government, sharpened by the disruption of the Jamaica trade and the Jamaica merchants' complaints about it. The effectiveness of the new vice-admiralty courts, which could try and execute pirates in the colonies without the delay and the legal complications of sending them to England. The career of Woodes Rogers, the privateer-turned-governor who arrived in Nassau in 1718 with a royal commission, a fleet, and an offer of pardon, and who systematically dismantled the infrastructure that had made Nassau a pirate haven, hanging those who refused the pardon and welcoming those who accepted it, turning the island's economics away from the pirate trade. The death of Bartholomew Roberts in 1722 in battle with the Royal Navy ended the last major pirate operation of the period. By 1730, the Golden Age was effectively over. Not entirely. Pirates have always existed and exist today in the Strait of Malacca and the Gulf of Aden and various other places where the conditions are right. But the specific phenomenon of the Golden Age of Piracy in the Caribbean, the period of a few decades when a particular combination of political instability, weakly governed ports, valuable trade routes, and the aftermath of multiple wars created the conditions for something that looked, from certain angles, almost like an alternative society, that was over. It lasted about 40 years. It produced a mythology that is still running on 300 years later. And underneath the mythology it produced real people. Thomas Avery, the pragmatic captain, eating with his crew. Edward keeping his charts dry. Samuel carving small wooden birds. Kofi at the helm in the dark, thinking about something we will never know. Mary maintaining her domain in the galley. Jem watching the stars from the crow's nest at dawn, thinking, "This is beautiful, this is one of the most beautiful things." They were not heroes. They were not monsters. They were people who had made an extreme choice in conditions that made the choice understandable, on a ship that was, by the standards of the world around it, surprisingly humane about the way it organized itself. They were, in the full ambiguity of the term, free. The specific experience of boredom on a pirate ship was different from the specific experience of boredom anywhere else, in the way that the specific experience of everything on a pirate ship was different because the stakes were different. Ordinary boredom, the boredom of repetitive work, of watching the same water, of waiting for something to happen, was part of every day. The Caribbean sky did not change very quickly. The water did not change very quickly. The ship did not change at all, because the ship was always the ship, 70 feet long, 12 feet wide, smelling of bilge water and tar and the particular combination of bodies and cooking that accumulated in an enclosed space at sea. The conversations you could have were limited by the people available to have them with. By 3 months into any voyage, most of what could be said between the 33 members of the crew had been said at least once. What remained were the conversations that needed repetition, the arguments that were not really arguments but rituals, in which both parties knew their lines and the outcome was predetermined. The stories that were told again because the telling was the point. The comfortable silence of people who knew each other so well that the silence was communication rather than the absence of it. Jem spent a lot of his off-watch time making rope, not because the ship needed more rope, it had rope, but because the act of making rope with his hands was something that kept his hands busy while his mind went wherever it needed to go. He had made enough rope in 3 years to rig a separate ship. Jonas used his off-watch time to sleep, with the commitment and efficiency of someone who had understood that sleep was a limited resource and should be acquired whenever available. Edward worked on his charts. Samuel carved. Kofi did something that nobody on the ship could identify clearly. He was often on deck in the off-watch hours, not doing anything that looked purposeful but present, aware, in a state that was neither work nor rest but something between. He was watching. He was always watching the water. He was reading it the way the navigator read the sky, looking for information that the water offered to people who knew how to receive it. The water, in his experience, had always had something to say. The specific institution of the pirate tavern deserves more than a passing mention because it was the shoreside equivalent of the ship itself, the place where the social world of Golden Age piracy existed in its most visible and most convivial form. In Nassau, the primary venues were a cluster of establishments that had names and reputations specific to the community that used them. They served rum and whatever else was available, which varied. They served information, which was their most valuable product. A captain who needed to know the latest news, which merchant vessels had left which ports, which naval patrols were working which routes, which ports had become hostile and which had become friendly, which pirates had been taken and which had returned with prizes, could find most of it in the course of an evening in the right Nassau tavern. The information economy of the Golden Age piracy was sophisticated. The pirates were not operating blind. They had networks. They had contacts in the colonial ports, in the merchant marine, among the dock workers and the harbor masters and the merchants who bought their goods. They had the intelligence that comes from being connected to the full social fabric of the Atlantic world, which was one of the advantages of the piracy trade that the legitimate authorities were slow to understand and slower to counter. The information moved through the taverns. Thomas spent his first evening in Nassau not drinking heavily but talking. He talked to a man who had recently put out of Hispaniola with information about the Spanish trade routes. He talked to a woman who ran one of the taverns and who had received a Royal Navy captain the previous week, and knew which routes the patrol was planning. He talked to a captain from Virginia who was thinking about a venture further south. By midnight, he had a clearer picture of the Caribbean than he had had when he arrived. He went back to the ship and slept better than he had slept in weeks. The ship was quiet around him. Nassau was quiet around the ship. The harbor, in the dark, smelled of salt water and the particular chemical smell of low tide, which smells everywhere in the world approximately the same. He lay in his hammock and listened to the harbor and thought about Edward's charts and the information he had gathered, and the routes that might be worth working and the risks that attached to each of them. He made some decisions. He went asleep. Samuel the carpenter slept less than the rest of the crew, not by choice, exactly. But the ship's condition was his concern at all hours, and his body had developed the habit of waking when there was a sound that required interpretation, a creak that could be structural, a change in the bilge level that meant water was coming in faster than it should. He had been at sea for 40 years. He was, at 61, considerably older than the average age of the crew, which was probably somewhere around 25. He noticed the difference between himself and the younger members of the crew most clearly at night, in the heat of the hold, where the young men slept with the deep, almost aggressive unconsciousness of youth, and he lay awake listening to the ship. He did not find this troubling. He had stopped finding it troubling sometime in his 40s. It was simply what nighttime was now, a time of listening, and of the quiet work of his hands on whatever he was carving, and of the particular peace that comes to people who have stopped fighting their nature. He had carved something for everyone on the ship. He was working in Nassau on something for Felipe, whose carelessness with lines had improved to something close to competence, which Samuel regarded as a genuine achievement worth acknowledging. He was carving a small seabird, a frigate bird, with its distinctive forked tail and its extraordinary wingspan. The frigate bird was the bird of the open ocean, the bird that spent almost its entire life in the air above the water, almost never landing on the sea, sleeping in brief stretches while flying. It seemed appropriate. He worked on it in the harbor light, the small knife moving with the patience of someone who had been making small things with great care for a long time. The wood gave up its form slowly. He was not in a hurry. He had, in this, as in most things, learned to take the time that the work required. One more modern comparison, before we let the night close. The idea of a workplace democracy, an organization where the workers have a genuine vote on major decisions, where the person at the top is accountable to the people below rather than to an external authority, where the profits of the enterprise are shared among those whose labor generates them, is not a new idea. It was not a new idea when the Golden Age pirates were practicing it. It was a very old idea that kept recurring independently wherever the conditions made it practical and the alternatives made it attractive. The pirate articles of the Golden Age were not theorized from first principles. They were pragmatic solutions to the specific problem of organizing a group of people who were, essentially, ungovernable by external means. You could not appeal to the king's authority. You could not appeal to the admiralty. You had only what you had: the people on the ship, their individual and collective interests, and the need to find some way to organize those interests that didn't result in the ship becoming an unusable chaos. The solution they arrived at: elected leadership, collective decision-making on major questions, agreed-upon rules, compensation for injury, was not ideological. It was practical. It worked, more often than not, for the period that it operated. The fact that it looks from the outside like a kind of radical democracy is an observation that the people inside it did not necessarily make. They were just trying to run a ship. We notice the politics because we're looking from outside, from a distance of 300 years. They noticed the chart, the wind, the prize, the next port. They were entirely in their present, as we are in ours. The difference is the water. The weather changed on the 16th day out of Nassau. It changed in the way Caribbean weather changes when it intends to mean it. Not gradually, not with much warning, but with a shift in the quality of the air that Kofi felt before he could articulate, and that the horizon confirmed within the hour. The clouds came from the east, which was not the usual direction. The swell changed first, the regular pattern of the trade wind swell disrupted by something coming from a different direction, creating the uncomfortable cross-chop that made the ship roll in a way that the straight Atlantic swell did not. Thomas was on deck within minutes of Kofi's call. He looked at the clouds. He looked at the swell. He said, "We're going in." He meant, "We are finding shelter before this becomes what it might become." The nearest island with anchorage was 4 hours away on the current heading. They made it in 3, because Thomas pushed the sail harder than was comfortable, and because the crew responded without debate. The squall hit 2 hours after they had the anchor down in a sheltered cove on the island's leeward side. It was not a hurricane. It was a substantial squall, and it lasted 6 hours, and it produced the specific misery of bad weather in an anchorage. The ship pitching and pulling at the anchor in a way that required constant monitoring, the rain horizontal and warm, the visibility reduced to the length of the ship. But they were alive. They were in shelter. The anchor held. By morning the sky was the deep washed blue that follows bad weather in the tropics, and the crew was wet and tired and mostly content. Jem said, to no one in particular, "That was a bad squall." Samuel said, "I've seen worse." He had seen considerably worse. The prize that the Patience took in the weeks following Nassau was a Spanish vessel, which complicated things considerably. The political relationship between England and Spain in this period was in one of its periodically tense phases, and the taking of a Spanish prize by an English crew that did not have a letter of marque, the document that would have made them privateers, authorized pirates operating on behalf of a government, was an act that the English authorities would have viewed as piracy in the full legal sense. This distinction between the privateer who had authorization and the pirate who did not was one of the more flexible boundaries in the maritime world of the period. Men moved across it in both directions, sometimes several times. A privateer whose commission expired in peacetime had the choice between unemployment and becoming a pirate. A pirate who received a pardon and a commission became a privateer. The line was always political. The practical activity on either side of it was the same. The Spanish prize was a small merchant vessel carrying hides and tallow, not valuable, in the way that sugar and rum and silver were valuable, but worth something. The Spanish crew was not harmed. They were put in their longboat with provisions and left to make their own way, which they did, reaching Havana with a report that the English pirates were working the waters south of the Bahamas. This report reached the colonial authorities. The colonial authorities forwarded it to the naval commander. The naval commander added it to a growing file of reports about English pirate activity in the Caribbean. The file was getting thick. This was, at the level of individual men and ships, how the noose tightened. Thomas called a meeting of the crew the evening of the Spanish prize. Not to celebrate, the prize was too small for genuine celebration. To discuss. The discussion was the kind that the pirate ship's democratic structure made both possible and sometimes challenging. A genuine conversation among 33 people with 33 opinions and 33 assessments of the situation. Thomas laid out what he knew. The Spanish report would reach the naval commander. The naval patrols in this area were already more frequent than they had been a year ago. The prize-taking had been thin. He offered 3 options. Move further south, toward the trade routes coming from the Spanish Main, where the prizes were more valuable but the risks from both the Spanish Navy and the English were higher. Move north, toward the New England and Virginia trades, where the targets were different and the competition from other pirates somewhat lower, or accept the pardon that was still nominally available and find another way to live. The third option was not proposed seriously. Several people laughed, and then several people did not laugh, and then the conversation went where it was going to go. They voted to move north. It was not a unanimous vote. Jonas voted to move south. Edward voted to move north, which was a more navigable choice from his perspective. Kofi did not vote. He had the right. He chose not to exercise it. He stood at the rail and looked at the water and thought about whatever he thought about, and the vote happened without him, and the ship moved north, as it had voted to do. The water of the Caribbean north of the Bahamas changes as you go. The brilliant blue of the shallow tropical water gives way to the deeper, darker blue of the Gulf Stream, the great current that runs north along the American coast and then curves east toward Europe, carrying warm water and the debris of the Atlantic world in its flow. The Gulf Stream was important to any sailor making the North Atlantic Passage, because using it or fighting, it made enormous differences to the time and effort required. Edward knew where the Gulf Stream was at any point in the year to within reasonable accuracy. He navigated by it the way Kofi navigated by the water's texture and color and behavior. The two men's different forms of knowledge, one formal, one embodied, complemented each other in a way that neither of them acknowledged but both of them relied on. This was one of the quiet things about the Patience. The complementarities that had developed between its crew members over time, the ways in which different people's different strengths had organized themselves into something that functioned, imperfectly but genuinely, as a working whole. It was not designed. It was assembled. It was assembled by the specific people who happened to be on this ship, in this period on this ocean, making these choices. And it worked. For as long as it worked, it was one of the more interesting small organizations in the Atlantic world. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and the watch had changed and the light was going in the west, Reggie played his fiddle. The music was different on different evenings, responding to something in the collective mood of the ship that Reggie read accurately without being told. On good evenings, evenings after a successful day, evenings in calm weather with a following wind, he played the quick dance tunes, the reels and the jigs that made your feet move without your deciding to move them. On difficult evenings, evenings of tension, of disappointment, of the particular heaviness that comes after a hard day in bad weather, he played something slower. Not sad, exactly, but modal minor, the kind of music that acknowledged difficulty without dramatizing it. And on the evenings that were simply evenings, no particular color, no particular event, he played whatever came to his hands, and what came to his hands was always something that fitted, because he had been playing for this crew for long enough that he knew them through his instrument in ways that words between them did not always reach. The crew listened, or half-listened, while they did their evening tasks or their off-watch resting. The music was in the air the way the salt air was in the air, not attended to directly but present, conditioning everything. Mary washed her cooking pots. Jonas updated his mental account of the shares owed to each man. Samuel carved. Kofi watched the water. Jem sat on the bow and looked at where the stars were beginning. The fiddle played on. The ship moved. The night came down. There is something I want you to understand about the quality of attention that a long ocean voyage produces in the people who make it. Modern life offers almost no equivalent. We have constant stimulation, screens and sounds and information arriving faster than we can process it. The ocean voyage in the early 18th century offered almost none of this. The water looked approximately the same as it had looked yesterday. The sky offered its weather, and then the same sky as yesterday if the weather was fair. The ship offered the same sounds, the same smells, the same 32 other people. What happens to a human mind in this situation, if you don't go mad, if you don't retreat into boredom that becomes its own kind of suffering, is that you learn to see what is actually in front of you. The water that looked the same yesterday is not the same. The color is slightly different. The surface texture is slightly different. A piece of wood is floating that was not there yesterday. Seabirds are following the ship, which means something. The quality of attention that long ocean voyages produced in the best sailors, in people like Kofi, in people like Edward, was a form of perception that had been sharpened by the absence of distraction until it could see what casual attention missed entirely. This is a genuinely valuable thing. We have largely lost access to the conditions that produce it. We are, in this particular respect, more impoverished than the pirates. The last thing before we let the night come. The Patience is at anchor, somewhere in the Caribbean on a night that is warm and still and has a moon. The moonlight on the water produces a road of light from the horizon to the ship, and Jem, who has the late watch, is sitting on the bow looking at it. He is 20 years old. He is in the crow's nest of his life, which is the age when you can see more of what's coming than you'll be able to see later. He doesn't know this. He is just looking at the moonlight on the water. Behind him in the hold the crew sleeps. Reggie's fiddle is in its case. Samuel's knife is resting. Mary's galley is clean and cold. The ship breathes around them the small sounds of a wooden vessel at anchor, adjusting, settling, existing. Thomas is awake in his own corner. Jonas is asleep. Kofi is asleep, or in that state that he occupied on the boundary of sleep, where he was aware enough to hear if something changed. Edward's charts are rolled and stored. The stars are out. The moon is out. The water road runs from the horizon to the bow of the Patience, and Jem is sitting at the end of it, looking back along it toward wherever it comes from. He is thinking, or not thinking. The distinction at 20 in the moonlight is not always clear. He is alive and free, and on a ship that is his in the way that a thing you have committed to is yours. This is enough. For now, this is enough. One final consideration about the pirates of the Golden Age, the question that historians return to and that the mythology tends to avoid, and that is the most honest question to ask. Were they good? The easy answer is no. They stole. They operated outside the law. Some of them committed violence that went beyond the minimum required by their profession. Some of them operated with cruelty that the mythology tends to overlook. Blackbeard's reputation was built partly on genuine terror. Some pirates killed when killing was not necessary. Some tortured captives. The record is not clean. The less easy answer is, it depends on the standard. If the standard is the law of their time and place, then no, they were criminals, defined as such by the authorities of the most powerful empire in the Atlantic world. If the standard is the human cost of the things around them, the slave trade, which moved millions of people across the ocean in conditions of deliberate brutality, which was entirely legal, the press gang which kidnapped men from their lives to staff the ships of an empire, the merchant system that worked sailors to injury and death for wages that barely sustained life, then the calculation becomes more complicated. The pirates were not heroes. The world they operated in was not a world of heroes. It was a world of competing violences and competing interests, and they found a way to extract themselves from one category of it and operate in a different one. They were free. Not free in the way that anyone is entirely free, but free in the way that matters. They made their own choices within constraints they had chosen on a ship that answered to them collectively. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, a great deal. And when you lie in your bed tonight, comfortable, warm, not going anywhere, not on watch, not answerable to anyone for the next several hours, spare a thought for Jem in the crow's nest. The view from up there before dawn was extraordinary. He thought so. And he was right. The repair of the Patience after the squall took 2 days at the island anchorage. 2 days of Samuel directing and the crew doing whatever he said, because when Samuel spoke about the ship's structure, there was no debate. He found a section of the hull planking that had been working loose, not dangerous yet, but it would be, and he recaulked it with oakum and pitch, the traditional method, working in the water beside the ship with the patience of someone doing a job that needed to be done correctly. He found a crack in the foremast that required a woulding, wrapping the cracked section in rope to prevent it from spreading. He found 2 pumps that needed adjustment. He fixed all of it. He was in the water for most of the first day. In the evening, sitting on deck drying out, he was handed a cup of rum by Mary, who had cooked something particularly good with the fresh provisions they had taken from the island, coconuts, fish caught from the lagoon, herbs that grew on the island's margin. He drank the rum. He ate the food, he said nothing, but there was something in the quality of his silence that was, for Samuel, the equivalent of eloquence. He was satisfied. The ship was sound. He had made it sound. This was what he did. This was what he was. In the morning the anchor came up and the Patience moved out of the cove and back into the open water, and Samuel stood on deck and listened to the ship. The sounds of her in the water, the way she moved, the information that a ship conveys to someone who knows how to receive it. She was sound. He nodded. No one saw him nod. It wasn't for anyone. It was the acknowledgement between him and the ship, the quiet confirmation between two old things that had been through a great deal and were still, for now, here. There is one more thing about the morning watch that I want to tell you. The morning watch on a pirate ship in the Caribbean in the early 18th century ran from 4 in the morning to 8. Those 4 hours in the tropics contained the entire transition from night to day, from the absolute dark of the pre-dawn to the full, assaulting heat of a Caribbean morning. The person on watch for those 4 hours experienced a compressed version of the whole argument between darkness and light, and if they were paying attention, if they were the kind of person who noticed things, they got to see it happen. Every morning, for as long as they were at sea, Jim paid attention. He had been paying attention since the first morning on the Patience, when the dawn over the Caribbean had surprised him out of the general misery of being new on a ship and not yet comfortable and not yet sure that this had been the right choice. The dawn had been very good. He had thought, well, this is something. He had been right. 3 years later, the dawn was still something. It was not the same dawn. It was a different dawn every morning. But it had the same quality of being entirely here, entirely present, entirely in the moment. The sky shifting from black to deep blue to the thin line of light at the horizon that was the first announcement, and then the announcement itself, and then the spreading of it, and then the sun, which in the Caribbean was not gentle and was not apologetic and was the most vivid thing in the world. He watched it every morning he was on the morning watch. He was on the morning watch approximately half the mornings of his life. He thought, if I am ever asked what was the best part, I will have to think about this. You are in your bed. You are still. The surface under you is not moving. It will not pitch in the night, will not roll with a wave, will not creak and complain with the sound of a wooden ship working in a seaway. You do not have to wake in 4 hours for your watch. Nobody is going to come and shake your shoulder and tell you the wind has changed and you're needed on deck. You are in your bed, and the night is quiet, and you can sleep as long as you need to. Think, if you like, about Gem on the Bow in the dark. The stars above the Caribbean, which were extraordinary. The sound of the water against the hull of the Patience, which was the sound that had become his ordinary sound, the sound he fell asleep to on good nights. The future, which he was not planning. The present, which was enough. The sea was very dark. The stars were very bright. He sat and looked at them, and the ship moved on. Sleep well. And that, for tonight, is where we leave it. If you've been with me all the way from Gem in the crow's nest to the bow in the dark, thank you. The Golden Age of Piracy was real people doing an extreme thing for reasons that made sense to them. Leave me a comment and tell me where you listened from tonight. And if you'd like to come back for the next story, the subscribe button is there. There are more ships to sail. Good night.